What about some of these crisis pregnancy centers that are basically faith-based, but then some of them are not, where they provide alternatives to abortion? Would you be opposed to them taking money from the federal government?
I would be opposed to them taking any money that is then diverted to religious use. If they're preaching to people, if they're proselytizing, if they're using religious arguments when they're making their pitch to the mothers, that I think would definitely would cross the constitutional line.
You and I were just, your organization and ours was just embroiled in a big case. It was a case where a Wiccan soldier had been killed in Afghanistan. He wanted the pentagram basically put on the memorials and whatever, and the government actually opposed it, while at the same time they had 33 different symbols, such as one for atheism and all of those kind of beliefs. And you came in and handled a case, and I did a lot of writing on that particular case. Why do you see that as important? There you're supporting a religious viewpoint. How do you see that as different than a lot of the things you stand against that maybe Christians would say, well, you're being bigoted, you're being hypocritical, so here you jump in the side of witches and whatever, and you won't defend a Christian?
Well, we were asking there for the government to acknowledge the fact that there's a religious body of believers out there that seek equal treatment. And if there had been a Christian group that was in the same way denied the right to use its symbol, we would have supported that group as well. But it seemed as though the Veterans Administration had a dual standard. They had, in fact, approved religious symbols of very small Christian groups, but they would not approve a symbol of a Wiccan group, even though there are probably hundreds of thousands of Wiccans in the United States. You're
aligned against the Christian right, usually. How do you view the Christian right? There's a book out with Chris Hedges, who's a former journalist from the New York Times, and war correspondent. He calls the Christian right a fascist movement. Do you agree?
I'm not comfortable with that term, fascist. I think that's a pretty severe...
Well, how do you view the Christian right?
I would say that it is a collection of politically active individuals who seek some sort of theocratic state. Most often, of course, it's going to be their definition of Christianity that they seek to elevate as the law of the land.
You see it as a dangerous movement?
I think it is a dangerous movement. I think it's dangerous because it believes that the state can be an appropriate instrument to promote theology, and I think that's always a bad idea.
You spoke earlier to our interns. You talked about the changing religious makeup of the country. There are less people calling themselves Christians. Why don't you discuss that amendment and then tell me where you think the country's headed in terms of all these issues that we're talking about, church and state issues?
Well, there are some interesting trends demographically that are going on. Larger numbers of people saying that they're secularist. The number of Christians dropping below 80% for the first time in American history.
People who call themselves Christians.
People call themselves Christians. And at the same time, really just an incredible diversity among that body of Christians, all the way from the far left to the far right theologically. Just an amazing amount of diversity there, and large numbers of people kind of doing their own thing. They're Christian, they're religious, but they're not affiliated with any denomination. They don't worship at a church every Sunday. A very interesting phenomenon. So I think that these trends are going to challenge our country in many ways, along with increasing numbers of members of non-Christian faiths, and they're going to agitate for their place in society as well.
So do you see a positive future for religious freedom in the United States?
I think we have some rough road to get over for the next few years, but I do have a positive view of that. The reason I say a rough road is because the Supreme Court has just really become extremely conservative, and I think we saw that the last term. Unfortunately, President Bush has left a stamp on the court that's going to long outlive his presidency. And I don't see this as a court that's going to be very favorable either to, if you look at the First Amendment establishment and free exercise provisions, this court's not going to be favorable to either side of the equation, unfortunately. And we're going to have to get through that. But once we do, I think that there's sort of a natural corrective in this society. We are people who value religious freedom and philosophical freedom, and that's going to sort itself out because we're not going to allow those rights to be seriously placed in jeopardy.
Your organization supported Michael Newdow, who is a renowned atheist, who fought a case to get under God out of the Pledge of Allegiance, the thing that school children say across this country every day. Some people think you really went too far. In fact, the Supreme Court case, which kicked it back on technicality, essentially said that in dictum. Don't you think that's going too far? What's wrong with a pledge where people just can't acknowledge God? And two words you're talking about.
I don't think it goes too far. I think that an individual should be able to express love of country and patriotism without making a religious affirmation at the same time. We have to remember that those two words, they were slipped in there in the 1950s. That's not part of the original pledge. And if the pledge was okay for 100 years without that religious affirmation, why can't we get back to that? That's the real tradition, the secular pledge that all Americans can.
So you think it's unconstitutional for kids to say those two words, under God?
I think it's unconstitutional to compel them to say it. And that has been a problem in some parts of the country where school officials don't seem to have gotten a message that they cannot force the recitation of the Pledge of Allegiance. I know that's what the courts have said, but there is still pressure out there.
People don't say you're not patriotic.
Well, I think we have to understand that dissent, even when it's unpopular, is oftentimes the highest form of patriotism. And you know, we made the best argument. We took it into court. Michael Newdow, we weren't representing him, but he was representing himself. He was not successful. And we're willing to live with that. I mean, to me, that's real patriotism.
Thank you, Rob Boston.
My pleasure.